People ask me sometimes what it felt like to go back in. I never have a clean answer for them, so I give them the one that is true. It felt like work. It felt like 15 years of reading buildings compressed into 30 seconds of standing at a threshold with smoke coming low and fast across the marble floor, and then a decision that was not so much a decision as a recognition. The kind of thing your body has already committed to before your mind finishes the paperwork. My name is Rael Casson. I spent 11 years in the Compact Auxiliary Corps as a combat engineer, not the kind that blows things up, though we did that too when the situation required. The kind that goes into a collapsed structure after the shooting stops and determines what is still holding and what is about to stop holding. You learn to read a building the way a doctor reads a face, the stress fractures, the load paths, the small signals that tell you how much time you have before something that is standing stops being so. You develop an intuition that is less like thinking and more like listening. The building talks to you if you have spent enough years learning its language. Most people have not spent those years, and there is no shortcut to them, and most people do not need to know this in any practical sense. Until sometimes they do. I want to be precise about what the work was, because it matters to what came later. A combat engineer in the Compact Auxiliary is not a glamorous posting. You go into spaces that other people have left or been driven from, and you spend time in them, methodical, unhurried time, learning what the space has to tell you about its own condition. You learn the difference between a wall that is under load and a wall that is merely standing. You learn what a ceiling sounds like when the material above it has changed its mind about what it wants to do. You learn to distinguish between heat that comes from a source you can reach and heat that comes through a medium conducting it from somewhere you cannot. These skills require specific practice, and the practice is years of entering damaged places and coming back out changed only in the sense of having more information than when you went in. My hands knew things my mind had never formally been taught. This is how 15 years of work accumulates. You do not decide to know something. You do the work until the knowledge is in your hands and does not require consultation. I had been out of the Corps for 3 years when I took the Velketh Palace contract. Security rotation, compact diplomatic liaison detail, organized standing in corridors work that my commanding officer at the liaison post described as a ribbon posting. Good for the record, nothing that would cost you. She was not wrong about the cost. She was not entirely right about the nothing. The Velthorin Palace staff were precise and unhurried, and they had been running that building for 200 years without serious incident. The Palace of Sornvale was old in the way large stone buildings get old, not declining, but layered. Every addition legible in the stonework if you knew how to read additions, which is a thing you learn after enough years of going into places other people have left. I walked the building on my first day in the core habit of rooms first, floor plans second, load-bearing walls, ceiling heights, egress points, the relationship between what the architect had intended and what 2 centuries of use and repair and small corrections had actually produced. My Palisade counterpart, a compact and precise woman named Saylorn who had spent 20 years in the Queen's household guard, watched me do this with what I would describe as professional courtesy, concealing mild puzzlement. "We have floor plans," she said. "Floor plans are what the architect intended," I said. "I like to know what actually happened afterward." She considered this briefly and returned to her own work. I continued mine. The relationship we developed over the 3 days of preparation was one I recognized from the Corps. 2 professionals working parallel to each other in the same space, with enough mutual respect to stay out of each other's way and enough alertness to know when things intersected. It was a functional arrangement, and I was comfortable in it. The diplomatic rotation involved 3 days of briefings and protocols, and a state reception on the 3rd evening. The Velthorin do not hold receptions the way humans do. Theirs are quieter, more deliberate, built around long pauses between conversations, careful attention to the order of the serving sequence, music that sits low in a room and contributes texture rather than filling the space. The compact diplomatic party moved through these rhythms with the careful alertness of people who have been warned about something they cannot quite read. My assignment for the evening was the East Corridor junction and the doorway between the corridor and the dining room passage, managing the compact party's transitions between spaces, standing in locations where I could be seen without being in anyone's way, projecting the specific quality of unhurried vigilance that is what the word reassuring actually means in a security context. I had spent years developing this kind of presence. It is not a passive skill. It requires continuous low-level reading of a room and its people, but it is a quiet one, and it meant that I was standing at the East Corridor junction, slightly to one side of the main foot traffic with my back to a section of carved stone alcove, when the evening changed. Queen Sornvale moved through the reception hall with the unhurried authority of someone who has been doing something for a long time and has long since stopped needing to perform it. She was taller than I expected. Most of the Velthorin were, but the Queen had an additional quality of presence that was not simply about height, a stillness at the center of her attention that made you aware, when she directed it toward you, that you were receiving something real rather than a social approximation of it. Her eyes were deep amber with an inner light that shifted when she was listening closely, and went very still when she had made a decision. She was courteous to the compact diplomatic party in the way of someone whose courtesy is precision rather than politeness. She gave each conversation exactly as much attention as it required, and not one unit more. Her daughter was not in the reception hall. Ceylorn had mentioned the princess once during the briefing, 7 years old, as near as the compact translation tables could render it, in the East residential wing with her attendants. She did not attend formal state events. This was long-standing and was not a subject for discussion. I noted it alongside the floor plan data and returned to watching the East Corridor. The alarm sounded 40 minutes into the second bell period of the reception. Not the soft tone that marked course transitions. Something lower, with a vibration that came through the floor before it came through the air, designed to be felt as much as heard. I registered it in my boots before I identified it with my ears. Ceylorn was at my elbow in 5 seconds. Her face had stopped moving in the way that trained faces do when the situation has become real, and the performance of calm has been replaced by the actual thing. "East Wing," she said. I had already turned. The smoke was at the far end of the East Corridor head height, not floor level, which told me the source was elevated. The color was wrong, too pale, with a blue-white edge at the leading margin that I recognized from 2 other occasions in very different circumstances. That color means something is burning that was not designed to burn. In a building with old ceiling vaults sealed with finishing compound over timber framing, that color means the compound has ignited. Resin-based finishing compounds burn hot and fast, and they feed a fire in ways the original construction was never designed for. They change the building's behavior in ways the architects could not have anticipated, and the fire protocols may not have accounted for. The air handling in the reception hall was pulling the smoke toward us faster than the guests had registered it. I watched it for 4 seconds. The draw was coming from the far end of the corridor, hard, in a direction consistent with a large overhead space losing containment. The smoke was maintaining density as it spread, not diffusing, which meant the source was still growing. A growing source with that color, and that draw rate would move faster than the standard evacuation protocol was designed to handle. "Is the nursery service corridor under the upper gallery?" I said. Ceylorn stopped moving. "The gallery runs above the north subsection of the East Wing. The nursery level is below." "Has your relay confirmed the princess is out?" A pause, not a long one, long enough. "I have not received confirmation." "How long has the alarm been running?" She checked her wrist. 50 seconds. 50 seconds without confirmation. A fire with a burn rate I estimated was outpacing the standard protocol by a margin I did not know precisely but could infer directionally. A nursery level under the section of the building I was most concerned about. These three facts had an answer, and the answer was not something I could delegate. "Get the queen out," I said. "I'm going in." She said something behind me. I was already in the corridor. I dropped into a half-crouch at the first junction. Smoke comes in layers, and the floor layer has the best air and the most survivable travel conditions. And your body knows this if you have spent enough years going low in bad situations. Mine knew it without being asked. I moved through the corridor in the half-crouch of someone doing something they have done before, which is the only reliable way to do it. There is a quality of attention that becomes available to you in a burning building that is not available under other conditions. It has to do with the removal of everything non-essential. In ordinary circumstances, the mind is processing an enormous number of parallel inputs: social context, background planning, half-finished thoughts, the residue of earlier conversations. In a burning building, all of that stops. What remains is the work, the temperature of the wall, the movement of the smoke, the sounds from above, the distance to the next waypoint, your body and the building in direct communication with nothing in between. I have heard people describe this state as fear. It is not fear, or not only fear. It is a kind of clarity that the core gave me and that I have never found in any other context. It is the reason that going in felt like work rather than like something else. In that corridor, with smoke coming in from the gallery above, and the ceiling doing what old timber does when it is on fire, I was more awake than I am in most ordinary moments. Everything had been cleared away, and what remained was exactly what I needed. The fire source was the gallery above. I knew this by the draw, hot air rising and pulling cooler replacement air in from behind me, using the corridor as a feed channel. Every step I took toward the gallery's end of the building was a step into a corridor that was helping the fire breathe. I knew this. I moved anyway, because knowing something unfavorable about your situation and moving through it regardless is a significant portion of what the core had trained me to do. The East Wing's upper gallery was a long vaulted space above the residential corridor, ceremonial storage, old timber framing, ceiling vaults sealed with generations of finishing compound. The compound had caught and was burning into the timber, and the timber was burning into the ceiling of everything beneath it. I was walking toward the middle of this, and I had a rough idea of how much time I had before the ceiling became something I should not be standing under, and the rough idea was not generous. The residential corridor was built for formality rather than efficiency. Wide stone flagging, high arched ceilings. The height was letting the smoke layer build before it hit the density that would stop me, which was the ceiling's unintentional contribution to my survival prospects. Decorative alcoves every 12 meters with carved stone figures that were, whether the architect intended it or not, structurally contributing to the wall's load distribution. Stone in a fire is what you want around you. It does not burn. It conducts heat, which lets you read the building's temperature by touching it. It gives you something real to put your back against when the ceiling decides to become unreliable. I used the alcoves as both waypoints and thermometers, reading each one with the back of my left hand as I passed. Core habit, taught to me by an engineer named Oda Veth, who had been the best structural reader I had worked alongside in 11 years, and who had told me that the hand you do not write with is the hand you use for building temperature, because it is more sensitive and because she had never, in 30 years of this work, needed to write anything inside a burning structure. I thought of her at the second alcove, where the wall was noticeably warmer than the first, and at the third, where it was warmer still. The gradient told me what I already knew about the gallery above, and confirmed the direction of the problem. At the first junction, I found an overturned serving cart and a relay device on the floor. Screen cracked, still transmitting. The dust pattern around it was the pattern of something dropped by a person running, asymmetric, thin, not yet fully settled, dropped in under 2 minutes. One person moving fast away from me toward the west egress, not carrying anything heavy, not carrying a child. I kept moving. The second junction was where the building changed quality on me. I was directly below the center of the gallery span, and the composite floor above was conducting heat downward through my boot soles, a warmth that had not been present at the first junction. Composite flooring has a higher thermal tolerance than the timber burning above it. This is not the same as being immune. A thermal buffer has limits, and above those limits it becomes a heat sink, and a heat sink in a ceiling does not fail by degrees. It holds and then it does not. The sounds from above were not cracking. I want to be specific about this because the distinction matters. Cracking is what stone makes. What I was hearing was lower and slower, old timber under sustained heat load. The sound of material that has been carrying structural weight for 2 centuries being asked by temperature to renegotiate what weight means. It is a sound you hear once and remember correctly without needing to hear it again. I had 4 minutes, possibly 3. The estimate was rough because I did not have complete information, and rough estimates are what you work with when complete information is not available, and you work with them by moving faster. The stair to the private family suite was through a door propped open with a decorative stone block, left that way by someone who expected to return and did not. I went through and down. The private suite was cooler by 15 degrees. Stone throughout, lower ceilings, heavier construction, no gallery directly above. An intermediate composite floor between me and the worst of the burn. The suite had been built in an earlier period than the east wing, simpler, more stone and less ornamentation, the construction standard of people who were building something to last rather than something to look at. The difference in construction era was saving the suite. I noted this without sentiment and continued. Second door on the right from the base of the stair. I had read the briefing document on the transit from the compact liaison office 3 days ago, the way I read all briefing documents given to me in 11 years. Once, carefully, then filed in the part of my mind where building-specific information lives. Floor plan data does not feel urgent when you read it. It becomes urgent at the moment you need it, and at that moment you are grateful for the habit. The nursery door was locked. Not swollen in the frame from heat, mechanism engaged, deliberately, by someone who understood that a closed door is a fire barrier, and a locked one is a better barrier. The Velthoran build their interior doors from compressed mineral board in a reinforced composite frame. 3 shoulder impacts, correctly placed on the frame rather than the door center, because frames give and doors do not. The third impact moved the frame enough for the mechanism to release. I went through into the nursery. A child's room, arranged with the consistency of someone who puts objects back in precisely the same position every time, and has been doing it long enough that the consistency is reliable and visible. Everything in its place, or displaced slightly by the vibration transmitting down from the gallery through the building's bones. Everything except the closet door. The closet door was half open at an angle I understood before I consciously analyzed it, the angle that maximizes the floor-level gap for cooler air intake while minimizing the inward draw of smoke from the room above it. The gap was at the bottom. That gap was deliberate. Someone small had read the physics of the situation correctly and acted on it in the dark, in a burning building, alone, before anyone came to help them. I crossed the room and opened the closet fully. Princess Lyrasail was sitting with her back against the rear wall, her knees drawn up, both hands pressed flat on the floor beside her. The posture of someone reading vibration through a solid surface. She had torn a section of linen from a closet shelf, dampened it from the small water vessel on the upper shelf. The vessel was dry and tipped, used completely, and folded it carefully across her nose and mouth. She had done this in a dark closet, in sequence, in the correct order, without instruction. Her skin was pale silver blue in the dimness. Her eyes were amber and large, and they fixed on me, and they did not panic. Not without fear. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make it sound like something it was not. She was frightened, the appropriate, correct kind of frightened that intelligent people experience when they have understood their situation accurately, and know that some of what happens next is not in their control. The fear was real, and it was inside her, and she was inside it and still thinking. And the thinking is what separates the people who come out of enclosed spaces from the people who do not. You cannot teach that capacity to someone who does not have it. She had it at 7 years old. It told me something about her mother, and about how she had been raised, and I filed both items. She said something in Velthorin. My 11 words of Velthorin were not the right ones. Human, I said. Soldier, I'm going to get you out. She looked at me for 1 full second. The look of someone who has been making correct decisions alone and is evaluating whether the new arrival is improvement or additional complication. She assessed me. She reached a conclusion. She reached up with both hands and took mine. That was the moment, not the going in, not the finding her, not the coming out through the maintenance passage into cold air. That single deliberate gesture from a child who had been making the right calls alone in a burning building and who recognized, when one appeared in a doorway, the person who was going to make the next one. She did not ask me to prove anything. She looked at me and decided, and the decision was made. I want to stay on the interior of that closet for a moment longer, because the moment deserves its accounting. What she had done, alone in the interval between the alarm sounding and my arrival, was the following. She had assessed the room, identified the closet as the highest quality shelter available given the materials present, entered it, located the water vessel on the upper shelf without being able to see it clearly, used all of it to wet a section of linen, positioned herself with her back against the far wall and her hands on the floor, and pulled the door to the specific angle that optimized airflow at floor level while reducing smoke draw from above. She had done this systematically, in sequence, without anyone to tell her to do it. She was 7 years old. I have gone into many spaces in 15 years and found many people in them, and what most people do in a burning room, even capable adults, even people with some emergency training, is one of 2 things. They either leave as fast as possible, which is correct when leaving is an option, or they freeze, which is what happens when leaving is not an option, and the situation exceeds what the person's experience has prepared them for. What they do not usually do is implement a systematic mitigation strategy, and then wait with their hands on the floor monitoring the vibration. She had waited. She had been thinking while she waited. When help arrived, she had evaluated it in 1 second and acted. I thought, going into the maintenance passage with her on my back, that whatever the Queen had done with the 7 years between this child's birth and that burning closet had been done very well. 3 minutes, possibly less. I ran the egress options while I was still in the doorway with her hands in mine. The stair route was over the section of composite floor I least trusted. The junction above it was the part of the ceiling I had been most concerned about since I reached the second junction on the way in. The corridor I had used to reach the stair was degrading behind me. The west egress required passing through the primary draw zone of the gallery's burn, the hottest corridor I had already moved through once, and which would be significantly worse now. The maintenance access was at the far north end of the private suite corridor. Pre-expansion construction, stone throughout, no gallery above it, no timber, no resin compound anywhere in its structure. A crash bar door into the north garden service area. 200 meters in the wrong direction through a corridor that was thickening with smoke, but thickening with smoke from a source that was behind me rather than above me. I picked her up. She was lighter than a human child her age by a significant margin. The Velthorin build for efficiency rather than mass, a species characteristic, reflecting generations of environments where carrying extra weight has cost the body accounts for across centuries. Not fragile. Narrow, economical, precise in the way of a small structure that has been built to do exactly what it needs to do and nothing beyond that. Her arms went around my neck without prompting. I felt her adjust her position against my back deliberately, not an instinctive grip but a considered one, distributing her weight relative to how I was moving. She was making herself easier to carry. In a burning building with 3 minutes, she was still thinking about my movement. I moved. The private suite corridor was different with her weight than without it. Not worse, different. The distances between doors felt longer than they had on the way in. The sounds from the gallery above felt closer. Both are perceptual distortions that training teaches you to note without correcting for, because the distortion contains real information about your own state, and your state is relevant data in a building that is actively trying to become something it was not designed to be. I noted the distortion and moved through it. At the junction between the residential corridor and the maintenance passage, I stopped for 2 seconds and set her back against the north-facing wall. Cool against my palm. Cool meant the fire had not reached that section of the building. Cool wall meant she could stand there for 2 seconds while I looked down the passage. 200 meters of dimness. No windows in the maintenance passage. No ceiling fixtures. The utility passage had not been built with anything beyond basic function in mind, which in a fire is exactly what basic function looks like when it is worth having. The passage goes to the garden, she said. Compact standard with careful formal emphasis, the precision of someone who has studied a language rather than grown up in it. Clear, accurate, delivered as information, not as reassurance. She was not telling me where the passage went to comfort either of us. She was telling me because it was a relevant fact. Yes, I said. I know the North Garden, she said. My father showed me. Without drama, without the weight of loss that the past tense of that sentence contained, which I heard and filed and did not open. Not then. As a simple fact being offered to the person who needed facts. Then you know where we're going, I said. Yes, she said. I picked her up again, and we went into the maintenance passage. 200 meters of cold stone. The air was clean below shoulder height. The building's general smoke was present in the upper register, a faint trace, but below it the passage was breathable without compromise. The foundation wall on the left side was old stone, compressed and dense, the original perimeter of a building that had been here before the east wing was imagined. It did not conduct heat. It was cool against my right shoulder where I let it guide me through the dimness. The crash bar at the far end was the kind of mechanism that exists specifically to work when everything else has had its complexity burned away by heat or panic or time. Military-grade simple. One hard push and the door opened and the North Garden came in. Cold air, night air, the smell of turned soil and growing things, and somewhere above and behind us, the sound and glow of the gallery doing what fire does when it finds room enough to do it fully. 20 meters onto the grass before I set her down. Minimum collapse margin for a wall in active structural distress. Habit. Habits in my profession exist because someone in the lineage of the people who trained me once stood at 19 meters and later had cause to regret it. And they passed the lesson forward in the way that useful lessons get passed forward in profession, where the alternative is people learning the same thing the hard way indefinitely. She held on for 5 seconds after I set her down, not with fear, with the specific intentionality of someone ending something that had a defined beginning and needed a defined end. Then she released my neck, stood on the grass, looked at the glow above the palace's east roofline where the gallery was still burning against the night sky, and then looked at me. Her face in the garden light was very still, not the stillness of shock. The stillness of someone filing everything. You came back for me, she said, in compact standard, with the emphasis wrong on 2 of 4 words. Yes, I said. She nodded once, with the conclusive quality of someone confirming a hypothesis they had held throughout a process, and which the process has now verified. From the south end of the garden came Ceylon at a pace that was not running only because 20 years of household guard discipline does not permit running in a garden attached to a palace during an active emergency. And behind her 4 palace guards and a medical officer. And she had the specific face of a person who has been holding a very bad calculation together in her head for several minutes, and is only now being allowed to set it down. She saw the princess and stopped. For less than a second, a fraction of a second, the kind of duration that does not register on anyone who is not specifically trained to notice it. Something happened in her face that was not part of any professional training she had received, and could not be entirely contained by 20 years of composure. Then she was professional, and she crossed the grass with efficiency and economy, and she kneeled and spoke to the princess in Velthorin, and the princess spoke back at some length. And at one point during the account the princess pointed at me, and Ceylorn looked up from where she was kneeling, and her look lasted for 3 seconds, which in Ceylorn's economy of expression was equivalent to a considerably longer statement. The medical officer came to me. Smoke inhalation, minor. Contact burns on my right hand from bracing against a wall near the second junction, without accounting carefully enough for the wall's temperature at that specific location, which was a lapse in the quality of attention I had been trained to maintain. He wrapped the hand without comment. I sat on a garden bench and waited for the debrief. The suppression systems were engaged within minutes of our exit. The East Gallery was a total loss. I had known this before I went in, and the knowing had not changed any part of the calculation, because the calculation had never included the gallery. The residential corridor held. The private family suite held. The old stone of the building, built with an integrity that outlasted the intentions of the people who built it by a margin measured in centuries, did what stone does when fire is confined to the materials that are not stone. The palace would lose a gallery, it would keep everything else. While I sat on the garden bench waiting for the debrief, the princess sat on the bench beside me. Not close, appropriate distance, the distance a child maintains when they have been raised with attention to such things. She had a small notebook and she was writing in it. I did not look directly at what she was writing, but from the angle I could see it was organized, structured text with what appeared to be timestamps in the left margin. She was writing the account while the account was still current. She wanted the times right. I watched the glow above the east roofline for a while. The suppression teams were doing their work and the glow was diminishing, the orange red of active fire fading to the duller yellow of suppressed embers, which has a different quality and is much more manageable. I had seen this color many times in many buildings. It is not a comfortable color, but it is a more comfortable one than the alternative. After perhaps 10 minutes, the princess said, without looking up from the notebook, "The maintenance passage, was that in the floor plan?" "No," I said. She made a notation. "You found it by walking the building." "Yes." She made another notation. Then she said, "I knew there was a passage. My father showed me the garden once from there. But I did not know how to find it from inside." I thought about that for a moment. About a child in a locked room in a burning building, who knew there was a passage to safety somewhere in the building and did not know how to reach it, and who had made the best decisions available to her within that constraint and had waited. "You made the right calls," I said. She looked up at that, the assessment expression, then she returned to the notebook. "I know," she said. "I am writing them down so I will not forget what the right calls were." We sat in a kind of quiet that was not uncomfortable until Ceylorn returned, and the formal part of the evening's remainder began. Queen Sornvale came into the North Garden 20 minutes after us. She was not moving quickly, and she was not performing the opposite of quick in the way of people who are demonstrating composure for an audience. She was moving at the pace of someone who has made all of her decisions about a situation and is executing them in the order they need to be executed. She had her daughter's hand in hers. The princess was walking beside her with the same quality of unhurried deliberateness I had seen in the reception hall before the alarm sounded. The quality was the same. The circumstances in which it was visible were somewhat different. I stood up when she reached me. She was taller than me by 10 centimeters. The amber of her eyes held the very still quality I had noted in the reception hall, the quality that meant she had decided something and was in the process of it. She looked at me for a moment, and then she spoke in Velthoran. The interpreter who had materialized from somewhere in the unobtrusive professional manner of people whose function requires them to be present without announcing it, murmured beside me. She says, "My daughter gave me the account, in correct order, with the time she observed noted." I glanced at the princess. She was looking at a point on the ground between us with the careful attention of someone who is aware of being looked at and is permitting it without returning it. I would learn through the liaison office's debrief 3 days later that the account she had given her mother was close to 400 words of precise Velthoran, organized chronologically from the alarm to the moment we reached the garden. It included her own decision at each point, why she chose the closet, how she dampened the fabric, what she assessed when I appeared in the doorway, what she read about the maintenance passage from the building's temperature and stone quality and air movement as we moved through it. It included her conclusion about why I had chosen the maintenance passage over the stair route. The conclusion was correct in every particular. She had been reading the building the whole time. She says, "I know what it takes to read a building while it is on fire. My mother built the East Wing. I learned its structure as a child, as she learned the one before it. I know what it means that you went to the correct door." I said nothing. There was nothing useful to add to it. She says, "What you did will be in the record, not the diplomatic record, a different record. My daughter's account and your name and what happened will be kept together in the way that true things are kept." The interpreter's voice was slightly more careful for the next one. She says, "I cannot give you what this is worth. I know this, but I will not pretend otherwise." She placed her hand briefly on my wrapped right hand. Not ceremonial, the gesture of someone acknowledging a cost they understand to be real rather than abstract. Then one final phrase short. The interpreter paused before translating, and the pause itself was a form of communication. She says, "You are not background." I finished the rotation 6 weeks later and returned to the liaison post for reassignment. The hand healed cleanly. Burns at that grade usually do if you manage them in the first 2 weeks without doing anything ambitious. I was not ambitious with it. I gave a full debrief to the compact liaison officer the following morning, which took 2 hours and covered the corridor conditions, the egress decision, the structural observations I had made about the composite floor, and the maintenance passage. The liaison officer was a careful man named Drav Keth who had been in his posting for 9 years and who wrote everything I said in a physical notebook rather than a recording device, which I had always found to be a good sign in a person. He asked good questions. He asked about the relay device in the corridor, which I described in detail. He asked about the composite floor temperature differential, which I estimated as carefully as I could from what I had felt. He asked about the maintenance passage door mechanism, and I told him it was military grade and had worked on the first push, and he wrote that down twice. At the end of the debrief, he said, "You went in without authorization from the Palace Fire Protocol officer." I said yes. He said, "The protocol officer would have been the correct person to make that call." I said, "The protocol officer was managing a 40-person evacuation and did not have the information I had about the composite floor temperature and the burn rate of the compound. I had the information and I had the relevant skills, and the child was on the wrong side of the fire." He wrote something in the notebook. Then he said, "I'm going to write the commendation recommendation on the basis that you made a judgment call in a situation where the standard protocol was insufficient, and your specific training gave you a reasonable basis for the call you made." I said, "That's accurate." He said, "Next time, tell the protocol officer what you know and let them make the call." I said, "Yes, sir." He closed the notebook. I believed him about next time. I also believed that if there was a next time with the same conditions, child in a burning building, correct information in my head, insufficient time for the full protocol chain, I would make the same call and we would have the same conversation afterward. Some things are not resolvable in advance. You make the call, you account for it, you move on. The Compact Diplomatic Bureau issued a formal commendation that generated 2 days of forms paperwork at the liaison office, and used the kind of language diplomatic bureaus use when the actual event is too specific for the standard form categories. Exemplary conduct, consistent with the highest standards of compact Velthoran cooperation, reflecting credit upon the auxiliary service. I signed the forms, filed my copy, and returned to my rotation schedule. Ceylon sent a personal communication, separate from the official documentation, 6 sentences long. 5 of them were professional, covering the structural assessment outcomes from the gallery fire and the palace's immediate repair timeline. The 6th said, "The princess has asked after you 3 times. I thought you should know." I thought about that, on and off, for several weeks without reaching anything actionable. The message came through 3 months after the fire. Compact relay routing, through the palace liaison office, addressed formally to my name and current posting in the standard header format. Below the standard header, added in a different hand, slightly larger letter forms, with the emphasis marks placed in a pattern I recognized as characteristic of someone who has learned compact standard through close study of written texts, rather than through native use or spoken practice. A secondary notation, from Lyra, for the soldier. I opened it. The body of the message was in Velthoran. A translation was appended below in palace interpreter format, the careful kind that preserves the weight of what was actually said, rather than smoothing it into the form that sounds most natural in the target language. She had written, "I made a list of what happened in the correct order. I have kept it. My mother says that a good account is the first thing a person owes the facts. I believe she is right. I put your name at the beginning of the account because you are the reason the account exists. I have been learning the bones of the palace the way you know the bones of buildings. My mother says you can tell when something is about to change if you listen to the correct frequencies. I have been practicing this. I think it is true of buildings and also of people and other things. I wanted to tell you something. I was not certain how to say it correctly until now, and I wanted to say it correctly. You came back for me when the corridor was wrong. I do not think you came back because of who I am. I think you came back because I was there and you knew the numbers. I know the difference between those two things. I wanted you to know that I know it." I read it 4 times. Then I set the message down on the liaison office desk and looked out the window at the compact transit yard, where a supply rotation was being loaded for the northern postings. A standard afternoon, nothing particular happening in it. She was right. I had not gone in because she was the queen's daughter. I had gone in because there was a child on the wrong side of a fire I knew how to read, and the numbers said I could get her out, and so I went. The who of her had not entered the calculation. It rarely does when the calculation is real rather than theoretical, and theoretical calculations are not what the situation that evening had required. But knowing the numbers had been 15 years of work that existed for a purpose larger than any single use of it. I had known this in some formless, unresolved way since my 3rd year in the Corps, when I had first walked into a space that should not have been survivable and found, on the other side of it, that it had been. I had never put language to what the purpose was. I had not particularly looked for language. The work had seemed sufficient without it. A 7-year-old girl with emphasis problems in secondary compact standard had found the language for me in 40 words and a careful translation. I typed a reply. It took me 4 drafts, which is 3 more than I usually need for a piece of writing. The final version was 9 sentences long. I will not reproduce all of them here because they were addressed to her and not to anyone else. The last two said, "You listen to the right frequencies. That is the whole thing. That is all there is to it." I did not know whether the emphasis marks in Velthorin would carry what I meant. I sent it anyway, because waiting for certainty about tone in a language you do not speak is a way of not saying something, and there are things that should be said. The relay confirmed delivery 2 days later. 6 days after that, a secondary confirmation came through the palace liaison office, in the same slightly larger hand with the emphasis marks that were almost but not quite right. Received. In the core, received is the confirmation that a communication is complete. Both parties have what they need to proceed. The transaction is closed and the work continues. That was enough. In my experience, enough is the only kind of confirmation that actually means something. The East Gallery was rebuilt over the following year. I followed the reconstruction reports because I had been in the building when it failed, and structural reports on buildings I have been in when they failed are the kind of reading I do not have to make myself do. The resin compound in the ceiling vaults was replaced across the full span of the east and north wings with a non-accelerant sealant. The timber framing in the gallery was replaced with composite beam construction. The nursery level's fire protocol was revised to include a direct palace guard relay as a secondary confirmation channel, running independently from the household communication system, with a confirmed-out requirement that could not be satisfied by a dropped relay device in a corridor that no one had checked. These were the right changes. They had cost something to prompt. I read about them in the Compact Liaison Office's quarterly infrastructure notes, which I read because reading the complete document is a habit I acquired in the core and have never found sufficient reason to drop. I read Section 4, which covered palace structural improvements, and I read the subsection within it marked supplementary, the kind of subsection that gets skimmed by the people who most need to read it, which contained a note about the renaming of the private suite's North Maintenance Passage. The name was in Velthorin. A translation was included, as it is in all compact documentation that contains non-standard text, as a matter of administrative practice rather than as anything particular. 2 words. Right frequencies. I read the subsection twice, which is once more than I read most subsections. Then I closed the report and returned to the structural assessment in front of me, which was a decommissioned relay platform on the outer margin of the compact's 4th administrative ring, and which required the same careful, complete attention that the work has always required, and which I gave it. Some things you carry forward: the habit of reading the whole document, the knowledge that a building talks to you if you have spent enough years learning to listen to it, the understanding that knowing the numbers is not the same as the numbers themselves. Knowing them is 15 years of going into spaces and coming out with a little more information, accumulated in your hands before your mind catches up. And occasionally, if the frequencies are right, you find that the work you have been doing was building towards something you could not have named while you were doing it, and someone else names it for you at the moment it becomes nameable. That is the whole thing. That is all there is to it.